Hey, good. Just swallowed some coffee the wrong way. Um, anyway, good morning, everyone. And thank you very much for those of you who replied to the Tuesday's morning prayer when we talked about faith. Good morning, Phyllis. Inmates. Yeah, feels that way. So thank you for those of you who replied when we started talking about faith on Tuesday. And I'll probably talk about that for a couple mornings. Good morning, Ann. Several of you replied about our struggle with faith. And I'm really grateful for those of you who did. And honestly, those, feel free to keep replying and, on email. It's rdaniker@ptd.net. The comments on here typically disappear. So I can't always read these comments after it's over. So reply to email, or you can text me 484-547-1581. Morning, Sherry. So I want to talk about faith. And one of the themes that really became apparent in the replies that you sent to me, morning, Pat, was the disappointments that we have with faith. And obviously, I think that's a very common theme. Good morning, Linda. So I want to talk this morning about disappointments that we have in faith. And good morning, Madison. I think that one of the things I really hope to show you, as hard as this is to accept and understand, that the disappointments that we have with faith really end up being part of a gift. And that may sound insane, but I hope that you'll stick with me. And hope this will make sense. Now, some of what we're going to talk about, I owe to either John Ortberg or Dallas Willard. I really can't remember who I got some of these thoughts from, but they're not original me, and they're not original either to them either. They're pretty well known. But so let's talk about faith. To have any kind of a relationship whatsoever, faith is really essential. In fact, I was holding that little glue bottle up in the thumbnail because faith ultimately is the glue that holds all of our relationships together. Now, I know that we tend to think that love is, and you could make an argument for that. But I think that what you'll find as we talk about this, that faith is the glue that makes love possible in relationships. So let me talk about that a little bit. The only way that we can really love another being that has a will of its own is to have faith or to have trust. That's how we relate to anyone. And that also includes, obviously, a relationship with God. That for us to have a relationship with God, faith is absolutely necessary. It's essential. We can't relate to another being that has a will of its own without having faith. We can't love another being that has a will of its own unless we have faith. Now, that obviously means that if faith is a necessary part of relationships, that means that disappointments are always going to be part of our relationships. So let me explain this. Now, just so you know, there's a lot of synonyms that I'll use, like the words faith and believe and trust. I know that there might be some little nuances that separate those words, but I'm going to use them as synonyms. So I might use those words kind of interchangeably to talk about faith or to talk about trust or to talk about what we believe. So I know that sometimes we talk about faith as if it can be just a list of the things that we believe. Like we might talk to somebody else about religion, for example, and we might say, well, what do you believe? And what follows is often a description of our beliefs. Like, well, I believe that God is a Trinity. I believe that Jesus is the Son of God. I believe that Jesus died and rose again. So in some cases, a faith is just to talk about our faith is a list of things that we believe. But the bottom line for relationships is that really faith is not just, it's much more than a list of statements that we believe. Faith is really at the core of all of our relationships. Now, to get at this idea of why disappointment is so much a part of our faith, for just a couple seconds, let's play with the idea of what would happen if we could remove faith from our relationships. What would we have if we tried to relate to beings that have a will of their own? And if we could take faith out of that, what do we have left? So imagine trying to have relationships where there was certainty, where there was zero doubt about that relationship, about that other person. Imagine that you could have a relationship in a way that that other being always did exactly what you expected, or what you wanted that other person to do, or what you asked that other person to do. Imagine having a relationship in a way that that other person was always reliable, and faith was never necessary, because any sense of doubt is removed. What would that relationship look like if faith was not part of the relationship? There's a great movie. Actually, the movie has been remade. I don't think the remake was nearly as good as the original, but there's an old movie called Stepford Wives, in which the author of that movie, whoever put it together, tried to show what it would be like if we removed faith from our relationships. And if you know the movie Stepford Wives, it's a movie in which there's this community in which the wives are replaced with robots. Now, those robots look exactly like their wives. Good morning, Art. The robots behave like their wives. They have the same voice, etc. But the wives have had their will, their capacity to make decisions, they've had their will removed. And so these wives exist simply to be like the perfect partner for men. And I guess, in a joking way, we tend to say, well, that'd be the perfect place for men to live, where their wives have had their will removed. But because the wives are in essence robots, they're no longer beings that have a will of their own. What you find in Stepford is that it's a nightmare community. Comically, we think, well, that'd be the perfect place to live, but it's not the perfect place. It ends up being a nightmare community, and there is no love whatsoever in that community. I mean, a man could love his wife like he loves a pizza, something that is there just to consume and just to satisfy him. But he can't love his wife as a being who has a will of her own, because there's no need for faith or trust. It's simply just a relationship of that other being does exactly what I want. There's no doubt. There's no question about that other person. It's all certainty. And any relationship like that is a relationship that really ends up being a nightmare rather than a relationship of love. Because when we remove faith or trust from our relationships, what we also lose is love. It's simply impossible to relate to another being that has a will of its own. It's impossible to love that other being without faith. It just can't be done. So faith is absolutely necessary when we're talking about being in relationships, or we're talking about loving another being that has a will of its own. Faith is necessary. That's why there's this verse in the Bible that talks about the fact that without faith, it's impossible to please God. And at first that sounds harsh. It sounds like God is making this demand that you relate to me by faith. But if you think about it, that's true for everybody. Without faith, it's impossible to please anybody. I can't please my wife. My wife can't please me. I can't please people in relationships. Good morning, Rick. Without faith. So that isn't, God making some demand and saying you have to relate to me by faith. It's just a statement of reality that when it comes to relating to other beings who have a will of their own, faith is absolutely necessary. So the only way for us to love anybody is to have faith as a necessary component. It's faith that holds it together. Now, here's the problem with having faith as like the glue that holds relationships together. Because we're talking about the necessity of faith, that absolutely means that every relationship comes with a sense of risk. It's always there in our relationships because faith is a component. You know, so for example, think about a small risk. Say that you're in a relationship, just kind of a casual relationship with somebody, a neighbor, that you're socially distancing from, whatever. And, you're outside standing on your sidewalk and you're chatting and you discover that your neighbor likes to read. Or, maybe you're just talking about what you're doing with your time in the evenings and you're talking about, movies that you're watching or, what restaurants you're getting food from, and you take what really is a risk. It's a small risk, but it is a risk. You take a risk and you say something like, oh, I just read a great book. And then you tell the person the name of the book, say, hey, I just finished the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And, you should read it. Or I saw a great movie, Mrs. Wilson, for example. Or you might say, hey, I've been ordering food from this Chinese restaurant. Well, I don't know. People are skipping Chinese restaurants right now. Anyway, that's another story. But, I ordered food from this great restaurant. So you take a risk by telling that other person, hey, here is something I liked and you should try it. And the risk is, that a week later, the next time you see your neighbor and you say, hey, did you start reading the book or do you watch the movie or do you try that restaurant? And your neighbor says, yeah, I did. And that was absolutely terrible. We were, there's a movie we watched, Mrs. Wilson, and we've been sharing that movie with a bunch of people. And about half the people come back to us and say, you like that movie? That was really stupid. So there's this risk. Now, that's admittedly a small one, but there's this risk of when you start relating to a person, there's always this risk of rejection. So in that small risk, there's kind of the question of like, oh, where do we go from here? Are you going to take the risk of sharing another book or sharing another movie? You're going to take the risk of saying, oh, well, maybe it was just a bad night for that restaurant. Because when we take this risk, and faith is a necessary component of our relationships. We take a risk. There's always the possibility of rejection. So that's taking a risk in a small way. Imagine now we take risks in a bigger way. What happens when in a relationship, in the early days of a relationship, when you finally, you're dating somebody in college or whatever it is, and you finally take that risk of saying for the first time, I love you. And how many movies are there, those romantic comedies where like that's the moment everybody is waiting for, that huge risk. That kind of a risk is huge because the possibility of rejection is also huge. But think about it, it's that risk that also makes possible just the euphoria, those fabulous feelings of falling in love. If there's no risk, then there's no euphoria. If it's automatic, if that person doesn't have a will of its own, it's back to the nightmare of the Stepford Wives, the nightmare of relating to another being who is just a robot. So it's the risk that really makes possible the euphoria of love. So we take that risk and we say to another person, I love you. And then that person responds positively and says, I love you too. And really that risk, that faith that you're showing in another person is really what makes love of another being possible. It's simply the only way that we can relate to another being is to relate by offering trust and faith in each other. And in every single relationship, especially relationships of love, your entire life in that relationship is going to be a relationship of the constant exercise of faith and trust in each other. And it's always going to be there. You share a secret with somebody, and in essence, what you're saying is, I'm trusting you with this secret. And maybe that person will betray you and you realize that it was trust misplaced. Um, or you're in a relationship with somebody who ends up betraying you. And that's why it hurts so deeply when we're betrayed, because that sense of my faith in you, my trust that existed between us has been broken. So to be in a relationship, always to have love, always requires faith and trust. Now, because there's risk in this, and there always is in every relationship, when we're talking about relating to another being who has a will of his own or her own, there's always going to be risk. That means that there is always going to be disappointment. Always. We're never going to be in a relationship with someone where there is not going to be disappointment. It just comes with the package of relationships, because that other being has the ability to exercise his or her will. And we're going to place our faith and trust in that other person. And sometimes we're going to feel as if our faith or our trust has been misplaced. Sometimes we will be betrayed, and sometimes we'll be hurt in small ways. And there's those small ways of sometimes they're going to reject something we like. We give them a gift, and we can just tell it wasn't received as well as we thought it might be. It might be misunderstood. So there's going to be small disappointments, and there are going to be large disappointments, simply because at the core of our relationships, there is always going to be faith or trust. And it's that risk that really makes love possible, because love is always this decision to love this other being. If there's no risk, then what we're talking about is not love anymore. We're talking about robots, which ultimately is that nightmare community. So when we love another person, when we're in a relationship with any other being that has a will of its own, to talk about love is always to talk about faith. And when we exercise faith, when we give our faith, when we give our trust to another being, what we're really doing is we're honoring that other person's dignity, and we're saying to the other person, I love you fully as a being who has a will of its own. What is it? Think about how in our society, when we try to love another person without honoring that other person's dignity, without honoring the other person's sense of being, what are we doing to the other person? We have words for it in our society, words like slavery and words like rape. When we try to say, I'm going to love this other person, but not honor that other person's will, those are crimes when we do that. So to love another person and to honor their will is in essence saying, I'm honoring your dignity. And that's what it means to have faith in another person, to trust another person, to say, you have a will of your own, and I'm going to honor that. I'm going to trust you. That's what is necessary to love somebody else. Now, our relationship with God is absolutely the same in many ways as it is with other beings, because when we relate to God, we're relating to we're relating to a being who has a will of his own. And God is at the same time, he's also relating to other beings, other human beings who have a will of their own. So, for example, when we start praying for other people, whether it's our kids or friends who we love, we're praying for those people. And maybe those people have rejected something important to us, like faith, for example. And we're praying to God and we're wondering, God, why is it that it's so frustrating, God, that this other person isn't responding in the way I'd want? We have to remember too that God is honoring in the same way that God honors our will. He lets us do what we want. The same way that God honors our work, he also honors the will and the dignity of those other human beings. So when we're praying for other people, there's often going to be disappointment because we don't get the response that we want. But it's absolutely necessary that God honors the will of those other human beings. And it's the same thing with God when we're praying, we're praying to a being who has a will of its own. So as hard as faith is, looking at the time, I got to wrap this up and we'll pick up again tomorrow. But as hard as faith is, because it comes with disappointment, faith is really this magnificent gift to us. It's what makes relationships possible. Without faith, we simply wouldn't be in relationships with anybody, much less God. So those disappointments that we feel, as hard as they are and as much as they hurt us, really it ends up being just this sense of God giving us this magnificent gift, this beautiful gift of saying, I'm honoring who you are as a human being. And we must do the same thing to God and others. We honor their dignity as human beings. We honor God's dignity as a person who has a will of his own. If we took faith out of the equation, which is sometimes what we say we want, we get so frustrated with it. But if we remove faith, we're no longer talking about love anymore. We're talking about something that's a nightmare. So it's painful and it's difficult for us. But in the end, it's this magnificent gift that we have as human beings who can relate to a God who has a will of his own. And he's saying, this is how much I love you. I'm giving you your freedom. And he does the same thing with other people that we also love and care about. And it can be frustrating. It truly is. But at the same time, it's so important to remember that even with these great disappointments and hurts, sometimes it just breaks our heart. It truly does break our heart dealing with other people. But in the end, it's the result of this wonderful gift from our God, this gift of freedom, this gift of we have a will. We're not just robots, and neither is God. So that doesn't, maybe it doesn't make the pain go away, but I hope it helps us to understand that the hurt that we experience comes because of the magnificence of love. And without faith, love is simply impossible. So, I hope that at least it doesn't make the pain go away, but I hope it just helps us to kind of reframe what it is that we're talking about when we talk about faith in God. Of course, it's going to come with disappointment, but that disappointment is the result of this, of just what really is a gift to us. So we'll keep talking about faith and try to talk about some of the issues that we have and how to grow it and exercise it. But I think that's where we need to start, that it's so necessary to who we are as human beings. So let me pray. And then it looks like a gorgeous day out there. It's pretty early when I got here this morning and couldn't tell, but I don't know. I'd like to get outside at some point. So let's pray, okay? God, thank you that even in what we're doing right now, just choosing to talk to you, that this really is proof of the fact that we exist in a relationship with you. God, I think about the prayer that Jesus taught us to pray, that, we ask for your will to be done. And even in the process of asking that, we recognize, God, that sometimes your will is contrary to our own. And sometimes that hurts us and it disappoints us, because you seem to be going in a different direction than what we'd like. Sometimes, God, you leave us in struggles and in pain. And even then, God, we continue to pray for your will. God, I know that sometimes we experience the conflict of saying, no, I'd rather have my will done. But we trust, God, we're ultimately throwing our trust on you and saying that we think you know better. So we ask for your will to be done in our lives. God, I recognize that brings with it a certain amount of pain and frustration. Sometimes we wonder where you're going, where our lives are going. Sometimes, God, it seems like all chaos. But God, we simply trust that you're a being who knows far better than we do where our world is headed. and you know what's best for us. So God, even though it's hard, we continue to throw ourselves on your mercy and on your grace by trusting you. I pray, God, that you be growing our faith, helping us to kind of live with our disappointments and trust you in them. And God, thank you for honoring us the way you do by giving us our own wills and freedom, and by giving us this magnificent gift of relating to you in faith. God, thanks for what looks to be a pretty day outside. Thank you for the gift of beauty and spring. God, I continue to pray that you'd bring resolution to this pandemic. We trust you with that as well. It's painful in a lot of ways, but we trust you with it and in it. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All righty, all. Yeah, well, have a good day, everybody, and love you all. See you.